There's something about the challenge of sculpting in low relief that's unusually tricky, yet I figured out how to do it, and I'll take you along on the sculpting journey while also answering a few Instagram questions. This is my 6th attempt at sculpting a low relief or bas relief or medallion as it's also called. My biggest struggle with my earlier attempts was keeping them flat enough and at a certain thickness. I find it so easy to sculpt in complete 3-dimensional depth, and if I'm not watching out for the depth, I can easily sculpt half of a 3D horse head without noticing it. To help with this challenge, I make sure to lay out my plastilina clay and flatten it evenly to the height I want the final relief, about a 1/4 inch or less. This will be my base, and my trick for success is also my first Instagram question and answer. One of my followers asked any tips for sculpting in general. Well, for low relief sculpting, I find it helpful to start thinking of this project as a drawing project. I've taken my time to draw out my horse head with the needle-pointed tool. Something about proportions and how perspective changes the proportions of the face are easier for me to solve as a drawing, and because drawings are flat, it's easier to keep the relief low in depth because it's already, well, flat. Then I start adding bits of plastilina clay, much as I do with my other sculpture projects, by thinking of my subject as a collection of simple shapes. The main difference between a complete 3D sculpture and what I'm doing here is now I'm making extra sure to flatten out those simple shapes to avoid an overly 3D look. It's not easy, though if I take my time and allow myself breaks to check the depth, I can always shave or carve away anything that is looking too bulky. And that's my next tip for this question. Allow yourself time to work back and forth and give yourself permission to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. After all, it's still progress. Artistic progress needn't be linear to be immensely helpful progress. My next follower asked if I have any tips for sculpting faces, especially eyes. Well, firstly, this is one of 2 videos about my face sculpting process. I'll have another video about my sculpting process for a 3-dimensional horse head sculpture in the future too, so if that's of interest, boop the subscribe button. As for the eyes, I tried to sculpt these in the plastilina clay I'm working with here and found that this particular clay is just a bit too soft to hold its shape well for the roundness of an eye, even when I froze it. Until I can try a harder consistency of plastilina clay, I'm falling back on a sculpture technique of using steel ball bearings for the eye. I found this technique can be a bit hit and miss in low relief sculpture, as sometimes it doesn't match the perspective in the relief. It works pretty well with profile relief sculptures, and after checking it, I thought it worked pretty well for this project. Now that I've blocked in all the forms, it's time to start blending. I start with the wax carving tool, as I find the metal does a good job towards smoothing while still offering lots of opportunities for subtle texture. And by the way, all my tools and supplies for each project are always listed below. My next question is, how long do medallions take? It largely depends on the size, though so far I'm finding that all of my low relief sculptures take a lot less time to complete than my three-dimensional sculptures. For example, I've completed most of my low reliefs within a few hours spread out over a few weekends, whereas my three-dimensional sculptures can take many hours spread out over months or years. Big difference. And I'll have the hours for this exact one at the end. In addition to my wax carving tools, I also try out the rubber tip clay shaper I've used on previous epoxy putty projects. Dipping a soft paintbrush in Gamsol, a type of highly refined mineral spirits, helps smooth out the sculpture where needed. Aside from smoothing, the Gamsol also helps remove or smooth out the pilling, those little bits of clay blobs dragged up by my wax tools. Isopropyl alcohol works well too. I'm using two plastilina clays right now, the soft one featured in this video and a softer one not featured yet, and I've noticed the softer one peels a little more. I'm curious to get some hard consistency clay and see if perhaps that peels less. Hey, that's looking pretty nice. I've mentioned in previous videos that I'm attempting to level up my realism sculpting skills, and critique is a valuable part of that process, both my own self-critique and friends. A big shout out for my bestie Melissa for her feedback, which she helpfully drew in white. The green lines are my additional notes. As I'm making my adjustments, I'm constantly thinking about texture. For example, I'm finding that hatching and cross-hatching texture is easier to smooth out, especially with the Gamsol. That's only half of it though. I like to leave in some texture, and in my brain I'm trying to balance decisions about what marks to make, which to leave, which to soften or completely remove. I'm trying to balance what looks visually interesting or different, and what looks appropriate to my goals for realism sculpture. In this case, I'm trying to convey the smooth coat and long mane hairs of a horse. I'm uncertain if I'll ever find the answer revealing the perfect balance, and if I'm honest, that unknown aspect is kind of exciting. In trying to find that balance, I will always have experiments and new things to try with every future project. My focus becomes the journey. And that's just within realism sculpture. Imagine the possibilities for texture and more abstract or stylistic results. As part of my journey to teach myself horse and animal sculpture, I'm exploring different types of clay beyond the epoxy putty I spent so many years using. Plastilina clay, or plastiline or plasticine as it's also known, is very different than an epoxy putty like Milliput, Aves, or Magic Sculpt. For starters, it never hardens or cures. This oil and wax-based modeling clay is non-drying, and one of the delights of that process is I have an endless working time to create and make modifications. If I need to put a sculpture away and return to it months later, I can still work the clay as if no time passed. That's a major bonus. Also, because it never hardens, I can always recycle it for other projects. In fact, if you've watched my earlier videos, you probably recognize this exact package of clay from my last equine mold making project. Just as with the epoxy putties I've shared on this channel, there is a difference in consistency and working properties between brands and even with each brand's product lines. So if you decide to give them a try and dislike it, just remember your perfect plastilina clay might be out there. For me, I think I might prefer a firmer plastilina for bas relief, and I'm curious to see if the challenge of this clay's smoothness would be an advantage for future 3D sculptures. I can see this being very easy to apply to armatures, for example. And just like with many art supplies, performance varies between grades, from professional to art student to play grade. Plastilina can be melted or frozen to help get the exact consistency desired. While the non-hardening quality brings a lot of opportunities, it does bring one challenge. If I want a permanent paintable copy, I'll have to make a mold and cast a copy in something like gypsum or resin. Which brings me to my final question of how do you make a mold for casting? I have videos about molding sculptures already on my channel, and I'd like to make another about molding low relief sculptures in particular, so for now let me briefly summarize. I've made molds of my previous medallions by mixing rubber molding materials like 2 parts silicone and pouring the mix over the sculpture while it's in a mold box. This results in a single part mold which is flexible, making it easy to remove the medallion if it's sculpted from cured clay. Unfortunately, the process can destroy a non-hardening sculpture, so I'll have one chance with plastilina. Once the mold is cured, I can pour a 2-part resin, plaster, or gypsum into the mold and pop the copies out once they are cured. And that's the gist, basically. Now on to the details. I talked about finding a balance with texture and preserving some of the interesting tool marks, and here's where I'm finding a new texture opportunity, leaving in the look of the clay itself. I had a teacher mention the value of letting art supplies speak, and by that he meant leaving in the visual cues unique to each medium, such as the glow of oil paints versus the more matte result of gouache paints, or the different textures between clays. When preserved, these textures tell viewers what materials they are, which was the speaking part. Plastilina looks so different from epoxy putty and even more different from the smoothness of resin. Granted, I can get them all to look like whatever I want if I give myself the time, though for this project I want to experiment with how I can let the plastilina clay speak through the texture I choose not to smooth out. I begin the long mane here as much as I do with all of my previous sculpture projects and other types of clays, starting with the highly technical noodle shapes. The main difference now is that I'm making sure there are no gaps underneath the hair just in case I want to make a mold, as those would form what are known as undercuts. Undercuts are not fun. Then I detail with both my wax carving tools and ball stylus tools, brushing away the blobs with a soft paintbrush. Sometimes the brush is dry, sometimes I use solvent for a softer look. While it felt different working in this softer clay, I found that this back and forth technique, which I usually use with epoxy putty, worked well with plastilina in the end. As with all my projects, I give myself plenty of breaks and opportunities for gentle self-critique and make corrections as wanted. My process often involves taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and I found every time I embrace that fact, I end up with projects I'm happy with, so it's always worth it. Speaking of worth it, introducing McCullough. This horse is inspired by the feral stallions in the McCullough Peaks range in Wyoming. There are less than 200 of a specific group of mustangs, and I strove to capture their unique, rugged features from the massive jowls to the dainty muzzles, thick necks, and windswept manes. I follow quite a few Mustang photographers, and every time a McCullough Peaks horse pops up in my feed, I can spot it immediately from its features, so I hope I managed to capture that caricature in clay. Thank you so much for coming along my sculpting adventure. I hope it brought a little joy in exchange, and with that, I'll let you get back to your day. Bye!